Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Again, this is Jonathan Sue here, and I have Lisa with me as well. She's going to be guest hosting today. Normally, we have Stella doing the hosting. Thank you so much for joining the October edition of our community form building webinar. For those of you who had registered earlier, I apologize for postponing this webinar a couple of weeks. It's just been a crazy time, a little bit busy over here at Zerion Software, and we wanted to make sure that we had some real good content lined up for you all. So I appreciate everyone's patience and glad that everybody was able to join today. Before we get started, let's go through a couple of webinar basics if this is your first time joining the webinar. Just a couple of quick updates in terms of keeping up with Zerion software. If you haven't checked them out before, we do have a variety of different blogs and communities that you can be a part of. The first one is our actual website blog, the Zerion blog, what we call the Data Management Digest, and that's going to be a great place to find articles and blogs related to specific solutions using the software. The community is going to be a forum open for customers and team members alike to discuss new topics, to discuss potential integration and feature requests, and any news is also posted there as well. And then finally, we do have two publications on Medium, one dedicated to our engineering team and another one to the customer success team. So if you want to follow either of those, you can head over to medium.com and check them out as well. If you're not already following us on social media, I would definitely recommend you do so. If you follow us on YouTube and subscribe to our channel, you'll see updates for videos that we post. Those are going to include things like release notes, new features, as well as recordings of webinars. Also, you can find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Now, before we get into this month's webinar, I do have a set of polls that I always like to launch. We're going to start with the first one here. And this is simply asking if you are a current user or not. This is going to allow me to gauge a little bit better the audience, and I'll tailor the webinar to the people who are here as well. So we'll just give this a couple of seconds to let everybody finish voting. And it looks like the majority of people have an active iFormBuilder plan, which is great. And I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. And we do have a fair portion of people who are just here checking things out. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for showing interest in Zerion software and iFormBuilder. Now, the second poll that I'd like to launch is going to ask everybody about their expertise working with the iFormBuilder software. So for those of you who are just checking out the webinar, you may not have any experience. There's nothing wrong with that. It's great. For those of you who have active plans, I'm sure you're aware that there are varying levels of skill or comfort working with our software. And so again, this helps me go ahead and gauge the skill level of everybody on the broadcast, and I'll again tailor the content and the delivery as such. All right, let's go ahead and close this out and share the results. So what you'll see here is that it looks like we have again a good number of people who are brand new, never used the software, and then we have a heavy distribution of people who can build forms that they can't do on paper, which basically means that they're leveraging the software at a level where they are able to build forms, digital forms, that are going to surpass the capabilities of what you could do on conventional paper and pencil forms. So that's awesome, that's great. Happy to see that. Now, because we have such a large contingent of people who are new to this webinar, I do want to go over the format. So the way this webinar works is this is very much so a community-driven webinar. Everyone over here at the Zerion software team, we're constantly asking people to post requests in the community. A lot of the times we get emails directly to us with either forms or questions or challenges that you're trying to solve. And I'd like to take one of those each month and highlight it during this webinar. So what we're going to be doing is for the next 30 to 40 minutes or so, I'm going to be going through a customer submitted form. And in this particular episode, what we're going to be doing is we're not going to be building the form from scratch, which is what I normally do, because normally I'm giving a brand new form that hasn't been made yet. This month, and this is actually due to a lot of requests that I received from different attendees, we're going to be taking a form that's already been made, that's been in production for years before, and we're going to go through it and do a little bit of a form audit. I know that this is a scenario that comes up with a lot of groups where they have forms and they work, but over time, whether it's us releasing new features or some of the JavaScript libraries being updated, there are things that you can do to update your forms, to enhance them, and I want to make sure that we go through the proper ways to do that in today's webinar. Now, moving forward, If you enjoy this webinar, go ahead and register for these webinars each month. They normally occur on the second Tuesday of every month. I can tell you though that with the holiday season coming up, we may have to adjust the schedule a little bit, but if you register for each webinar, you'll get updates to those dates anytime they're updated. While you're in today's webinar, go ahead and ask questions at any time you'd like, and absolutely talk to us, whether it's during the webinar, after the webinar, through email or through chat, and just communicate with us and we'll do our best to serve you as we can. Now for today's webinar, I want to give a real big shout out and a big kudos to Meta. They are the group that went ahead and volunteered this form for us to go through and dissect today. I really appreciate it, and I'll be sure to send over a copy of the revised form to you all afterwards. Now again, we're diverging a little bit from the normal content of this webinar. Normally at this point, I would go through and show you the form that we're going to build and then hop into the form builder. At the very end, I like to highlight best practices and strategies that were used during the webinar. We're going to do this backwards today. What I'm going to do is we're going to start with the best practices and strategies so that you have an idea of what we're going to be looking at, and then we're going to dive into the form and actually make some of these changes. So when I did the form review of Meta's survey that they sent to me, these were some of the best practices and strategies that I saw being highlighted as ways that we could enhance the form. The first one is you want to make sure that you intentionally name each of your elements. Now there's two fields that this corresponds to. Most people are really good about setting their label to be nice and clear and descriptive because that's what the data collector sees. However, there's another field called the data column name, or name for short, and sometimes that field gets neglected a little bit. You want to make sure that those are named intentionally because that is your identifier for each element. The next thing we're going to look at is we're going to make sure that we are very cognizant of the keyboard, the input type for certain elements. This is going to do two things. One is going to allow you to have your data collectors fill out the forms faster because they will have the appropriate keyboard displayed. The second thing is it's going to reduce the amount of errors you have based on input, which is really helpful. Now, the bottom three best practices and strategies are going to revolve around smart controls. For those of you who are newer to iFormBuilder, smart controls are going to be any sort of dynamic behavior that the forms do. For example, a calculation or skip logic, conditionally showing or hiding fields. All of that falls under the category of smart controls. So the three things we're going to look at today are: one, regarding smart controls, we're going to make sure that we consistently populate our dates in both operating systems. We want to make sure that we have empty placeholders to avoid caching. And then the last thing is we're going to take a look at option lists, specifically when to use the key value and when to use the sort order for writing your conditional logic. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the form real quickly here. I have my iPad reflected onto the screen, and we're going to open up the survey form. Now, this is a pretty lengthy form, so I'm not going to fill out everything, but I want to give you a high-level overview of what the form is about. So this form is a survey form, and so at the very beginning, you'll see that the form's label, it guides the data collector to say what they're supposed to say and to help them fill it out. I'm going to go ahead and say yes up here. You see they can choose the name of the lead firm here. I'll pick one. And then you have a variety of different fields, such as your ID number. That's going to pre-populate fields here. You can choose a survey cohort. And then you have a variety of different fields that you fill out throughout this form. Okay? And then these are going to drop down and be able to be filled in more depth. Okay? And then once you finish the form, you just press done and the record is complete. So this form looks pretty straightforward on the device. Now, this was a great form to use as a demonstration because there's actually a lot going on under the hood here. Let me go ahead and refresh all my pages to make sure that I haven't timed out yet. And now let's go ahead and jump into the form itself. Now, for those of you who are brand new, this is our form builder. So this is a web-enabled tool that will allow you to build your forms out. There's two primary views I'm going to be switching between. This is what we call the device view, and that's just going to give you a waterfall version of your form. So each element is going to show up in sequential order, top down. This is very similar to what it will appear as on the device. If I click over here in the upper left corner, this brings me to what I call the table view or the list view. This is going to give you almost like a spreadsheet view of your form with a variety of different details. In fact, I can go ahead and add in other fields here as I like. This view is really helpful for editing and taking a high-level view of your form because you can see element to element, whereas the device view is going to be useful when it comes to adding new elements over here on the left-hand side, or looking at all the possible properties for a specific element. So going into deep configurations or building your form for the first time, we want to use the device view. If you have an existing form and you want to look at it, or you're going to be adding smart controls, then I would recommend you use the table or the list view instead. Now, the first thing I wanted to look at was actually the select element at the top, name of the lead firm. Now, if we go back to the device, when I open up this form, you'll notice that it's really difficult to read these names here. This is what's called a select element. It's going to be tied to an option list, which is a predefined set of values that you choose from. And the way this element works is you can only choose one. So you'll see if I press one and then another, it jumps over to my new selection. The challenge with the select element is that it shows in line with your device. And that means that you're going to run into scenarios like I have here, where the wording can be cut off sometimes. Now, there's a more appropriate element to use here, and that's going to be your pick list. Your pick list is also an option-based element, so it's going to be tied to an option list. The difference is a pick list is going to show up more like a drop-down menu, so you're not going to have to run into text that's cut off. So the first thing we're going to be doing on our form today is changing this element from a select to a pick list. Now, in order to do that, over here on the right-hand side, you'll see that there is an element type called select. Now, before I change this and save the form and update it and do all that stuff, I want to highlight this red error message because this is a request and a pitfall that I see people fall into all the time. If I'm going to change this element's data type, that's actually going to cause that column's data to be lost. Now, if you're building a form from scratch, brand new, not a big deal. You don't have any data in there yet. However, given the scenario we're in now, where this is a production form, we want to make updates to it, we have to be very careful not to break anything and especially not to delete any data. So in order to make this change, what we're going to actually do is we're going to keep this element here and we're going to swap it out in a sense with a new element that's going to be a pick list. Now, the way I do that is I have 3 steps that I like to follow. The first step is to actually duplicate the element. So I'm going to click here to copy this element down below. Let me go ahead and save real quickly. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take this old element and we're going to call this name of lead firm old. Save one more time. Now, the reason I'm changing the name of the old element is because I actually want to use this name here for my new one. So what's going to happen is if you have any integrations built out, that identifier is going to point to the new element instead, as opposed to the old one. Integrations stay working and functional behind the scenes, but your form is going to get that enhancement. So as I adjust, this is the second step, as I adjust my element here, I can choose a pick list. My option's already set because I duplicated the select. And all this is working well. I'm going to save this now. And what I want to do is actually go back over to my form and check my progress. So for those of you who are newer form builders, this is definitely a habit that I would recommend you getting into, is testing your form pretty frequently. Even those of you who are more advanced form builders, I'm sure you've run into the scenario where you build a form, you think it's working correctly, or you think what you wrote is correct, but in fact there was a small mistake, and the more you build before testing, the harder it is to diagnose. So building in small chunks is absolutely advantageous. We're going to fill this out, and you'll see here I have the select element, the old one. Underneath I have the new pick list, name of firm, and it shows as a drop-down menu, which is much, much easier to read. So I've effectively added that pick list to my form now. The last step I need to do is go ahead and disable the old element. So here on the select, I'm going to go up to my attributes list, and I'm actually going to disable this, meaning that the select element here is no longer going to be visible on the form anymore. Now that's different than deleting the element. If I delete the element, I'm losing the data. Disabling it means we're just archiving that column, It's not going to be used anymore, but the data remains there anyways. Let me go ahead and sync my device, and we'll take a look at this first adjustment we made. Okay, as this is syncing, let's give it 1 second, and we'll open up our form. Choose yes, and now you'll see that select is gone, but my pick list is here instead, with much easier drop-down list to read. Okay, so that's the first enhancement that we're going to make. Now, there were 2 main points here. The first point is that if you have a longer list, I would recommend normally probably 5 or more options. You're going to use a pick list over a select element. The second teaching point here is that if you do have to change your element's type, make sure you follow the process of duplicating the element, adjusting the new one, and then disabling the original. Otherwise, you may run into, like it says here in this error message, data loss. Before we move forward to the next part of the form building exercise, Lisa, I want to check in real quickly. Are there any questions from the audience that we could share?
No, there's no questions.
Awesome. All right, let's keep on going then. Now, what I'm going to do here is switch over to my table view, as I talked about before. This is going to give me a nice high-level glance of the entire form. Now, earlier when we were going through the best practices, I brought attention to the two different names of each element, specifically the label and then the data column name, or name for short, as you see in this heading. Now, a very common practice we see in form building, and in fact, we even have a button for it, is to base your label or your name, is to base your name on the label. So what happens is you type in your label text, the name is going to be emulated in a database-friendly manner. That means everything is going to be lowercase. It means you won't have any special characters, and then everything will be separated with an underscore instead of a space. Now, the problem with this is that it's going to be difficult to use these data column names in the future when you're building out your smart controls. That based on label button is really convenient, but what I've found, especially as people mature in their form building, is there is less and less of a need to do that. And in fact, when it comes to a design perspective, it's actually worth the time to set your data column names intentionally. Now, as I'm looking through here, a couple of things I note. Things like ID number, you'll see there's a period at the end of NO. That's why we have this underscore here. But it's very easy to miss that underscore whenever you're typing out your data column names in your smart controls later on. You'll see it here in client code as well, client name, and county. So what I would recommend we do here is we're going to go into this view, and I'm actually going to clean some of these up. So I'm not going to do all of them, but we'll do a few of these. And I just like to clean up these data column names a little bit. Don't have any trailing or leading underscores. And as I scroll down a little bit, you'll notice you have things like this, location village. This is actually a double underscore. There's 2 of them here. Again, something that's very easy to miss when you're starting to type out your smart controls. And then what happens is when you're trying to debug this, it takes a really long time to identify the mistake. So I'd like to clean things up like this as well. As I scroll down further, you're going to see long data column names like this one here. And you'll see that it actually mimics the label text. As now we'll ask about the crops that you grow. It gets cut off because there is a maximum length for the data column names. So for things like this, what I like to do is I like to give a shorter version, something like this, crop growth. And what that would allow me to do is now use that data column name in my smart controls, and it's much easier to read. It's much easier to identify what that element and that subsequent value is all about. So I'm going to go ahead and save this briefly. Now, one reason I wanted to highlight this in comparison to the first change I made is that modifying your data column name is not going to cause any data loss. That's one of the questions that I get very frequently after somebody actually makes the previous mistake and deletes some data. They say, well, I don't want to touch my data column name. It's going to make me lose my data. And that's not true. You're able to change the data column names and your data stays the same. However, there is one thing I want to draw attention to, which is that if you have any smart controls, you'll notice that the smart controls reference elements based on their data column name. So this is saying the element named now ask, if it's equal to 0, will show this. which is actually up here. If I scroll down a little bit more, you'll see a few other ones. A4 education level equals 5, which points to here. And so if you change your data column names, make sure you go through and do a quick scan of your smart controls to make sure you update it there as well. That's one of the more common things that we see from people trying to do the right thing and clean up their forms, is they don't finish that cleanup process and they leave fragments of the old data column names behind. So make sure you do a quick search there. Sometimes I'll do a find and replace. That can be helpful. One of the other things I would recommend doing is trying to avoid data column names like this, because if I take a look at this data column name, it's very difficult to see what that means. I'm not really sure exactly. You want your data column names to be legible, and you also want them to give you an idea of the actual data that's being held inside of that element. So again, to recap, if you change the element's data type, that will cause data loss because you're changing fundamentally the way the data is actually collected. Whereas if you change an element's data column name, you're not going to lose any data, but you want to make sure that you go through your smart controls and adjust your form accordingly. So now we're going to move into those smart controls, and we're going to look at a couple of different behaviors that we can go ahead and modify and improve on. Now, that third bullet talked about setting up the date element specifically to make sure that it's compatible across both operating systems. If any of the listeners have been with us for a long time, you'll know that both iOS and Android have different operating systems. They are different operating systems, but more importantly, they run different JavaScript engines. And that is really our defining quality here, is that we offer a JavaScript-enabled form builder. So that's both a blessing and it can be a curse in some sense. One of the biggest challenges that we'll see groups run into, and that we've fixed and put a tremendous amount of effort in over time, is that cross-compatibility, making sure things work the same on both operating systems. Now, this one comes up probably more than a lot of the other ones do, which is why I wanted to highlight it. I also noticed it in this form when I was doing a review, and that is the way you default a date, a time, or a date time element to the current timestamp when you open up the form. If you look over here on row 18, the survey date, this is the smart control command to default this element to the current date and time, which is exactly what we want. Now, I can tell here, and this is from, again, over time of the JavaScript evolving, this form was originally built for iOS, because in iOS, what we originally recommended you do was add this word new date, and then we're assigning that new date to survey date, which is our data column name. This causes issues in Android, however, and so our new best practice and recommended smart control for this is to actually remove the new portion. And so you just have survey date equals capital D, the capital letter is important, date with the open close parentheses. I'm going to go ahead and confirm this and save it at the top. So that's an important one. I see this very frequently in forms where they'll see new date, and I always recommend you change it to just date without the keyword new in the beginning. That doesn't mean that the form will not work with new there, but this is going to give your form a higher level of cross-compatibility between the two browsers. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk through was defaulting some of these fields. If any of you have been building more complex forms, you may have run into issues where you'll see calculations being stored from the previous record, or fields that are entered being stored from the previous record. That's called caching. And so what's happening here is the app is trying to run as fast as possible, and so it's going to take a previous value and then put it into that field. Now, to avoid caching, a lot of the times what we'll do is we'll set a dynamic value equal to effectively an empty field. Now, the empty field varies based on the element type, which is why I wanted to talk through it today. These three elements in particular is what I wanted to look at: a text-based element, a numeric element, and then the option-based elements, a select in this case. Now, all three of these elements are going to have a different default value to give to make sure that you clear out the caching. For a text area, what we're going to do is take the data column name, I'm going to copy and paste it, and we're going to say it's equal to what's called an empty string. And so this is just two double quotes back to back. The double quotes are going to be the beginning and ending boundaries of the text that you want to store in this text area. So by having the two double quotes pushed right next to each other, that means we're effectively storing nothing in this element. So that's how we're going to do an empty text area. This syntax is also going to apply to a regular text element. Now, as we move down to the number field, numbers are a little bit trickier. Because this input has to be numeric, it's very difficult to set a number field equal to an empty value, because an empty value is not a numeric value. So what we recommend doing in this scenario is one of two things. If you have to keep it as a number element, what we recommend doing is actually setting this equal to 0. So we'll do something like this. Now, the obvious challenge with that is that the 0 might be a valid entry. The data collector might think that field was already filled in and skip it. So there are some usability challenges with setting the number field equal to 0. But when it comes to making sure your calculations run appropriately, when it comes to making sure that you're not going to have any cached values, this is our recommended best practice for doing so. Now, the other thing you could do is you could take that number element and have it be a text element instead, and then use a number pad as entry. So what that will do is that means that the user will not be able to enter in any text values. They would be confined to the number keyboard. So that's your other option there, either setting the number element to 0 or making the switch to a text element and then setting the keyboard to number pad, and then you can do, again, the normal standard empty string for your text field. Lastly, when you have an option-based element, the way you're going to set the dynamic value for an option-based element is based on what's called the sort order. Now, the sort order is something that I haven't talked about yet, but you've actually been seeing it on the screen this entire time, and it is this numeric value all the way on the left-hand side here. So the sort order is going to be the arrangement of the elements, or in the case of an option list, the arrangement of the options. So if I wanted a specific option to be defaulted, I could say data column name equals, and then that sort order for the value. Now in the case I want to default this to be empty, because the sort orders start at 0, what we do with iFormBuilder is we use the value -1 to represent an empty option. So that means that a selection has not been made. If it was 0, it would show the very first option, and then all the way down through each of the different whole numbers. But again, setting -1 to either a select here, or if we had a pick list where we were up above, either one of these would go ahead and default the element to be empty when it is opened. So if you run into any caching issues with text-based elements, numeric elements, or your option-based elements, these are your strategies to make sure that that doesn't happen, and to make sure that you can default the value to prevent the caching of a previous record's input. Lisa, checking in again real quickly. Any questions? It looks like it's been pretty quiet. Hopefully that's not a bad sign. Hopefully people are just very intensely listening.
Yeah, there's no questions.
All right. So we're going to move on to the last best practice I have, which is focused on your option list. And this is a topic that I hear very, very frequently. There is certainly an art to choosing the right type of strategy for your option list. And I'm going to go through the pros and cons for the remainder of this session, this webinar. Now, the condition value is going to be the field that controls the visibility of the elements. So what that means is we're going to set what's called an expression. That means that if this evaluates to true, we're going to show the element. If it evaluates to false, we will hide the element. So anytime you have a condition value, what we're normally doing here with an option-based element is we're saying, for example, if this field is equal to 0, this is pointing to the sort order. So if it's equal to 0, we'll show it. If it's equal to 1, we'll show this. Now, we can go into our form for a real example of this. Now ask is the select element. Now is it okay that we ask you a few questions? If I choose 0, which is the first choice, it's going to give me this question. If no, the survey is complete. If I choose the second option, which is index of 1, it's going to give me all of these fields, as you can see from the condition value. So let's hop over here. Let's start up a new record. And here is our initial select element. If I choose the first option, sort order 0, you'll see I get that question, the text element. If no, then the survey is complete. If I choose the next sort order here, I get all these fields, as you can see on the condition value. So that's going to go ahead and preface this section with how the condition value works, also with how we're referencing this option-based element using the sort order. Now, if any of you have gone through our iFormBuilder certification, I'm sure you're well aware that our recommended best practice is to write your condition values, your dynamic values, anything regarding the option list using the key value as opposed to the sort order. Now, in order to understand what this means, I'm going to go ahead and open up the option list manager, and we're going to take a look at these option lists. So let's go ahead and take a look at a random option list here. Let's choose this one here. We can choose technology received. Now what you have here are 3 properties: the sort order, the label, and the key value. And I want to give an introduction to what each one of these represents. The sort order is going to be the arrangement, as I said earlier, and so that's how you saw this form be controlled with the condition value. We're checking the sort order 0 versus 1. Now, the reason this is something that we recommend against doing is this limits you from being able to rearrange the options. So let's say I wanted yes to appear first. I could actually switch these sort orders here. Oops. Let's do a quick save. And you'll see yes is, oops. Yes should be 0. There we go. And then no is 1. So I can do a quick save here. And now my sort order has changed, the arrangement has changed, but all the smart controls I built are now broken. So that's not a good thing here. The key value, however, is the unique identifier for that option in the list. So that means that the key value cannot be repeated within a list. It also means it is not going to be changed when the sort order is changed. So by tying the key value to my conditions, I'm now free to rearrange my options as I please. So that is the reason we recommend using a key value for comparisons inside of your condition value. Now, what does that look like? What we will be doing here is, instead of using just the data column name equal to 0, what we're going to do is we're actually going to use the command zc display key, and that is going to reference the key value as opposed to the sort order. And now we're not going to check to see if it's equal to 0. We're going to check to make sure it's equal to no. And then I'm going to do this. Now for down here, we would do something very similar. And actually, let me do this. I'm going to copy this and paste it down here. But instead of no, we want it equal to yes. And I'm going to save. And we're going to take a look at these changes. Let me go ahead and sync my device. All right, let's open up our survey. And we'll try these buttons out. So if I press no, we'll see it still behaves the same. If I press yes, it behaves the same as well. So now what you have is an example of using originally the sort order, and we've now enhanced it to use the key value. Now I said at the very beginning that we're going to go through some of the art, some of the nuance in terms of when to use each one. Right now I just showed you why and when you want to use the key value, but there still is a time and a place for using the sort order in order to do your expressions and your condition values. To find an example of that, I'm going to scroll down towards the bottom of my form, and we're going to see this field here. So what I have here, I'm going to copy this. Actually, you know what? Let's do this. Let's go back to my other view because it gives me a larger screen to take a look at. I want to find 1B. Let's see what. Here we go. So the condition value for this element, as you can see, is pretty long. Now, if you're not used to writing any sort of smart controls or JavaScript expressions, I'm sure this looks like a complete bunch of nonsense to you. Bear with me, I'll go ahead and explain it. This element is going to show if this field is equal to sort order 1 and this whole piece is true. Now, this big piece here is going to take this element, name of lead firm, and if it's equal to 0, or this is a double vertical bar, or it's equal to 1, or it's equal to 2, or it's equal to 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So this has to be equal to 1, and this basically has to be between 0 and 11, except for being 6. So those are going to be my conditions. Now, anytime you're working with a range of options where it's going to be qualifying as a yes or a no, it might make more sense to actually use the sort orders. And in this scenario, you would then be bound to make sure that you don't rearrange the options too dramatically. So what I want to do is go ahead and rewrite this. Instead of saying name is going to be equal to 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, we can take this top piece here. I'm going to write it below just so that you can see. And name of lead firm is greater than or equal to 0, or name of lead firm is less than or equal to 11. Actually, I'm sorry, this is going to be an and. My mistake. And name of lead firm is not equal to 6. Okay. Now there's a lot of different expressions here. I'm actually going to take these out because I don't need them anymore. But this new condition value is much shorter and it accomplishes the same thing. So let's talk through why I wrote it this way. The first thing is this stays the same at the beginning. So this element has to be equal to sort order 1. And my option-based element, name of lead firm, has to be greater than 0 and less than or equal to 11. So that means it has to be within the same range I'd set before. But the other part of it is that it has to be not equal to 6. Now, you may be asking yourself, why do I need this middle part here? Why can't I just do this? So make sure it's equal to 1 and then make sure that name of lead firm is not equal to 6. The reason being, going back to my other best practice, if the option-based element has not been selected, it's equal to -1, which if you're using your logic rules is not equal to 6. So that would be true, even though you probably haven't selected anything yet and you don't want this to execute at that point. So what we're going to make sure is that it is greater than or equal to 0. Now we are going to set an upper bound, and this could technically be omitted if you wanted to skip this part. But we just want to make sure that something was selected, greater than or equal to 0, and it was not option 6. So that's how we can take these older sort order based expressions and simplify them using a range. So again, sort order is going to be helpful because it's numeric when you want to do a range-based comparison. But if you want to do an equality comparison like we did earlier, then my recommendation is to use the key value. All right, Lisa, I want to check in one more time. Any questions come through during the webinar?
No, no questions.
All right. So what I want to do now is, as we start to wrap this up, I do have a third poll that I would like to launch. This is going to give me some quick feedback on the level of form building in the webinar. I want to make sure that these webinars are tailored to the audience. This is going to allow me to fine tune the presentations month to month and improve every single time. All right, we'll let this stay open for a couple more seconds. It looks like, for the most part, the webinar was comfortable, a good review for people, or some people found it challenging but informative, and that's great. That's exactly where I want the majority of people to be. Obviously, I don't want the webinar to be too easy that you don't learn anything, but I also don't want it to be so hard that you can't follow along. I'm going to leave this open for a few more seconds. Now, as I said before, the purpose of this webinar was a little bit different. Normally what I do is I build ground up, and in those scenarios, a lot of the times the form building is a little bit more advanced. But today what we did was we did a review. So hopefully this was more geared towards being a good refresher for people, making sure people don't miss any of those best practices when it comes from updating your forms. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And I did see a question come through real quickly, Lisa. Did somebody ask a question?
Yeah, they want to know if the recording will be available to all the attendees.
Good question. And that's actually something I forgot to cover earlier during the introduction. Yes. So what we'll be doing is, in the next 48 hours, I'm going to be going and downloading the recording, editing it, and I will upload the recording to YouTube. So if you're subscribed on our YouTube channel, you'll get a notification of that. The other thing I will do is I will update our community forum thread, which has the recordings of all of the previous webinars as well. Okay. Lisa, any other questions?
Nope, that's the only question.
All right. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for hosting. Everybody who's on the broadcast, thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you all next month.